but I painfully learned that the Bible is not a reliable source of truth. I used to preach it, I used to believe it. It's full of unhistorical comments, it's full of anachronisms. You read recently last month out of Tel Aviv how the Bible got it wrong about the domesticated camels during the time of the Patriarchs. That's just a factual archaeological error.
Numerous discoveries have turned up in several areas of the Near East arguing for a much earlier domestication date. First, an Aramean camel rider carving on display in the Walters Art Museum, Baltimore, dated to the 10th century BC, conflicts with the latest suggested 9th century BC domestication. The artifact was found at Tel el-Halaf in Mesopotamia by Max von Oppenheim, who had originally dated the piece to the early 3rd millennium BC. This carving predates the theory of several scholars by at least century, and forces a recalibration of their theory. Moving past the 9th century BC theory, and examining the viability of a 12th century BC theory, similar problems are discovered. In Lower Egypt, Petrie found a dromedary statuette, which appears to be carrying 2 water jars. Based on provenance and the style of the pottery and the water jars, Petrie concluded the artifact was in fact from the 19th dynasty, dated between 1292 to 1190 BC. An even earlier attestation from Egypt, again in the form of ancient petroglyphs representing domesticated camels, was discovered next to Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions on a rock face in the Wadi Nib. To the right of the inscriptions are 2 distinctive animal petroglyphs. Camels that were represented as walking caravan style across the rock to the right easterly direction. Although the first camel has been partially defaced, the trailing camel is distinct and easily identifiable as a dromedary. The lead camel appears to be followed by a walking man. A second walking man is clearly leading the trailing camel. Next to these inscriptions is an Egyptian hieroglyphic inscription translated Year 20 under the majesty of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt Namer, son of Re-Amnams, living like Re eternally. With boundaries of Amnams III, a 12th dynasty ruler in the 19th century BC, and the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions in the 15th century BC, with no current evidence for activity in the area much later than 1500 BC, the camel petroglyphs could be dated to sometime in between. Therefore, the archaeological remains indicate that humans began using camels as pack animals in this area no later than the 16th century BC. From the Levant, a Syrian cylinder seal dated 1800 BC depicts 2 small figures riding on a 2-humped camel. It has been argued that the riders are gods, not humans, due to iconography found on other parts of the seal such as a divine star and a winged deity. While the artist may have been depicting the couple riding on the camel as gods, it is also possible that they are a royal human couple. Further, a depiction of gods riding upon a camel does not invalidate the idea that humans were riding upon camels at the time, but rather supports it by suggesting the idea came from reality. If the camel were a mythological creature such as a sphinx, then the scene would support a fanciful idea of the riders. However, at least 6 real animals are depicted on the seal, and the only clearly supernatural figure appears to be the winged deity. Thus, the riders on the seal suggest that riding upon camels was known in the Levant as early as 1800 BC. In MacDonald's analysis of camel warfare in ancient Arabia, he notes that it was customary for 2 riders to share a single camel. He found that they would use the camel to get them to and from the battle, often riding 2 to a camel, but would dismount to fight. If defeated, they would remount and flee, again often 2 to a camel, with one rider trying to ward off the pursuers with his bow. While the knowledge of this practice comes from a later period, it demonstrates the plausibility of the 2 riders sharing the camel being men rather than gods. Another figurine, that appears to suggest an early date for camel domestication is found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The figurine is a small copper alloy statue of a Bactrian camel, equipped with what appears to be some type of harness. The artifact is dated to between the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BC, from Bactria Margiana. Thus, there is evidence indicating early camel domestication from several geographical areas of the ancient Near East. 3 texts dating to approximately the same period as the Patriarchs attest to domesticated camel use. A Sumerian text found at Nippur from the Old Babylonian period, from 1950 to 1600 BC, gives clear evidence of the domestication of the camel by that time, for it alludes to camel's milk. Another text mentions a camel in a list of domesticated animals during the Old Babylonian period 1950-1600 BC in a Sumerian lexical text from Ugarit. The third text comes from a cuneiform ration list found at Elac in the level 7 Middle Bronze Age city. This particular Elac tablet reads, 1 measure of fodder camel. Here we have a text stating that camels in the city were given food rations, an action which would only be done for a domesticated animal. The aforementioned texts appear to be clear evidence from the 2nd millennium BC for domesticated camels in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the northern Levant. Yet, evidence for camel domestication may be found even into the 3rd millennium BC. A second set of relevant camel petroglyphs in Egypt come from a rock carving near Aswan and Gezer in Upper Egypt. This carving depicts a man leading a dromedary camel with a rope, along with 7 hieratic characters to the left of the man. The entire carving was dated to the 6th dynasty of Egypt, 2345 to 2181 BC, based on the inscription, the style, and the patina. This places the use of domesticated camels in Egypt at least as early as 2200 BC. Other objects from Egypt included a limestone container, missing the lid, in the shape of a lying dromedary carrying a burden from a 1st dynasty tomb at Abu Zar el-Maliku, and a terracotta tablet with a depiction of man riding and leading camels, dated to the pre-dynastic period. In Turkmenia, Altındip, excavations revealed models of carts with camels yoked to them, in contrast to horses or cattle in other areas. The artifacts representing this utilization are terracotta models of wheeled carts drawn by Bactrian camels. This type of utilization goes back to the earliest known period of 2-humped camel domestication in the 3rd millennium BC. This is relevant not merely because it demonstrates the use of domesticated camels, but the early date of the stratigraphic context in which it was found is quite astonishing, from 3000 to 2600 BC. This discovery is reminiscent of the camel figurines with saddles found in a 2nd millennium BC context in Yemen, both of which show very early use of camels as pack animals and mounts. Finally, biological camel remains have been discovered at multiple sites in stratigraphic contexts from long before the Iron Age. Camel bone, dung, and woven camel hair dated to 2700 to 2500 BC have been discovered at Sri Sukha in Iran, preserved in jars. This reinforces the suppositions that these are domestic stock, and that the Bactrian was domesticated slightly earlier at the border of Turkmenistan and Iran. In addition to the findings in Iran and Turkmenia, discoveries of camel bones in a 3rd millennium BC context have been discovered at the Levantine sites of Arad and Jericho. At the sites of and Nur and Ras Ghanada in Abu Dhabi. Fauna from a late 3rd millennium BC context included a large collection of camel remains, along with limited remains of domestic cattle, sheep, and goats. Woven camel hair rope dated to the 3rd, or early 4th dynasty was also found in Egypt at Aswan. At the very least, this suggests that the camel was used at these sites as a food source, but likely in some domesticated sense, since camels usually would have been kept outside of settlements, and lived and died primarily in the steppe areas. Thus, finding camel bones or other biological artifacts in a settlement excavation is highly unlikely, and it follows that scribes, based in urban settlements, would not often mention the camel. This is a plausible rationale for the limited amounts of excavated camel remains and texts mentioning camels in any capacity. For those who adhere to a 9th century BC, or even 12th century BC date of domestic camel use in the ancient Near East, archaeological and textual evidence must be either ignored or explained away. Bones, hairs, wall paintings, models, inscriptions, seals, Documents, statues, and sli from numerous archaeological sites all suggest the camel in use as a domestic animal in the ancient Near East as early as the 3rd millennium BC, and certainly by the Middle Bronze Age. The wide geographical and chronological distribution of findings related to camel domestication further strengthen the argument that the camel was domesticated far before the Iron Age, and with new excavations and analyses, additional evidence will likely reinforce this theory.